in the endless expanse of the Mongolian steppe where the wind carries whispers of 1,000 forgotten stories, where grass bends under the weight of time and the sky stretches so wide it swallows the very concept of boundaries. A child was born into a world that knew only survival, and a boy emerged who would one day make emperors tremble at the mere mention of his name. But this is not a story that begins with glory or conquest or the thunder of 10,000 hooves shaking the earth beneath them. This is a story that begins in blood and betrayal in the coldest winters, where death was not an enemy but a neighbor who visited often and stayed long. The year was sometime around 1162, and on the harsh plains where the Mongol tribes lived and died by the sword and the bow, a woman named Holon gave birth to a son, and they say he came into this world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist. An omen the shamans whispered about in the flickering light of their felt tents, a sign that this child would either spill rivers of blood or drown in them, and they named him Temujin, a name taken from a Tatar chieftain his father Yasuge had recently captured, and in that naming was embedded the very essence of the steppe, where your identity was earned through strength and taken from those you defeated. The grasslands stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills of green, and gold that turned white and deadly when winter came howling across the plateau, bringing with it winds so cold they could freeze the breath in your lungs and turn flesh black within hours. And in this unforgiving landscape the Mongol tribes lived in circular felt tents called gers, structures that could be dismantled and moved in less than an hour, because survival meant mobility, and staying in one place too long meant death from raiders or starvation or the merciless cold that cared nothing for human ambition. The smell of mutton fat and fermented mare's milk hung thick in these tents, mixed with the acrid smoke from dried dung fires that were the only source of warmth, when the temperatures dropped so low that even the hardiest warriors wrapped themselves in layers of sheep wool and leather. And young Temujin learned early that comfort was a luxury reserved for the dead. His father Yasuge was a minor chieftain of the Borgigan clan, a man who had carved out a small measure of respect through raids and alliances. But respect on the steppe was as fleeting as morning frost and twice as fragile, and when Temujin was only 9 years old, his world shattered like ice under a warhorse's hoof. Yasuge had taken his son to the Okanot tribe to arrange a marriage, a common practice to forge alliances in a land where today's ally could become tomorrow's executioner. And there Temujin was betrothed to a girl named Bort, a child with eyes that held the fierce intelligence of the steppe itself. But on the journey back, Yasuge stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars, and they recognized him as the man who had killed their kinsman and humiliated their clan. And they poised his food with a patience that spoke of hatred refined over years into something pure and lethal. He died slowly over several agonizing days, his body convulsing as the poison worked its way through his system, and with his last breaths he called for Temujin, but the boy could not reach him in time. And when death finally came, it brought with it not peace, but catastrophe for the entire family, because on the steppe a clan without a strong leader was meat for the wolves. The tribe that Yasuge had led, the very people who had eaten at his fire and sworn oaths of loyalty, abandoned his widow and children almost immediately, taking with them the horses and livestock that meant the difference between survival and starvation, and they left Holon and her children to die in the wilderness, because compassion was a luxury no one could afford when winter was always just months away and resources were measured in survival days rather than abundance. Temujin watched his mother dig for roots in the frozen ground, her fingers bleeding and cracked, watched her catch fish in icy streams with her bare hands, watched her gather wild onions and garlic and anything edible, while his younger siblings cried from hunger that gnawed at their bellies like a living thing. And in those desperate years something forged itself inside the boy, something harder than the iron tips of Mongol arrows and sharper than the curved blades their warriors carried. But hunger does not merely sharpen the body, it twists the soul into shapes that civilization would never recognize. And as Temujin grew into adolescence, the tension in that cramped gyre became unbearable, because his half-brother Bektar began asserting dominance over the family's meager resources, stealing fish that Temujin had caught, claiming the best portions of whatever food their mother managed to scavenge. And on the steppe where every mouthful meant another day of life, such theft was not mere rudeness, but a death sentence delivered slowly. The final confrontation came on a day when the sky hung low and gray like the belly of a wolf, when Temujin and his full brother Caesar tracked Bektar across the grasslands and found him sitting on a small hill watching over the family's few remaining horses. And without ceremony, without the elaborate codes of honor that would later define his empire, Temujin and Caesar shot their half-brother dead with arrows, watching him fall like a sack of grain while the wind carried away his last breath, and somewhere in the distance a hawk screamed as if nature itself was bearing witness to this fratricide born of desperation. Holin was horrified. She who had fought so hard to keep her children alive now saw them killing each other, and she raged at Temujin with words that cut deeper than any blade, calling him a destroyer, a mad dog who would consume his own family. But the boy who would become Genghis Khan had already learned the most fundamental lesson of the steppe, which was that mercy and starvation were twin brothers, and only one could survive. The murder of Bektar brought consequences as swift and merciless as a winter storm, because the Tashid clan, who were distant relatives and rival claimants to his father's legacy, saw in this act the dangerous ambition of a young man who would not accept his place at the bottom of the tribal hierarchy, and they came for him in the night, not to kill him outright, which would have been a mercy, but to enslave him, fitting a wooden kang around his neck, a heavy collar that prevented him from lying down or resting properly, a mobile prison that announced his shame to everyone who saw him. For months Temujin was paraded among the Teshid camps, a living warning to anyone who might harbor ambitions above their station, forced to serve as captors, beaten when he moved too slowly, mocked by children who threw stones at the boy in the wooden collar. And yet even in this degradation, his eyes never lost that fierce burning quality that unnerved even his jailers, because they could see that this young man was not being broken, but rather compressed like coal into diamond. The escape came during a festival when fermented arag flowed freely and the guards grew careless with drink, and Temujin slipped away into the river, submerging himself in the icy water with only his face above the surface, breathing quietly, while search parties passed within feet of him, their torches reflecting off the water like fallen stars, and he stayed there for hours until the cold had leached into his bones and his lips had turned blue and his fingers could barely grip the reeds he clung to. But he stayed because freedom was worth any amount of suffering, and death by freezing was preferable to slavery. A man named Sorkin Shira from the Tashid clan found him shivering by the riverbank, and in an act of stunning compassion that violated every tribal law, he helped Temujin hide, fed him, gave him a horse, and sent him back toward his family, risking his own life because he had seen something in this desperate young man that reminded him of what the steppe could produce when it forged a soul in its harshest furnace. Temujin returned to his mother's gyre, gaunt and scarred but unbroken, and he knew now with absolute certainty that the old tribal system that had abandoned his family, enslaved him, and murdered his father through treachery was a structure that deserved to be torn down and rebuilt according to principles of loyalty and merit rather than aristocratic birth. Though he did not yet have the words for such revolutionary thoughts, only the burning conviction that the world needed to be remade. It was time to claim what his father had promised. Time to return to the Olkanut tribe and marry Bort, the girl who had been waiting for him through all these years of chaos. And when he finally arrived at her family's camp, with nothing to offer but his name and his determination, her father Desekian looked at this thin, scarred young man and saw not a beggar but a survivor. And he gave his daughter in marriage along with a gift of a magnificent black sable coat, the kind of garment that could purchase alliances and favors from even the mightiest chieftains. The marriage to Bort was not merely a union of two young people, but the first thread in a web of alliances that Temujin would spend the next decades weaving across the steppe. Because Bort brought with her not just beauty and intelligence, but connections and legitimacy. She was the proof that despite everything that had happened, he was still worthy of being treated as the son of a chieftain. With that precious sable coat, Temujin went to find Togrul, known as the Wang Khan, the powerful leader of the Karat tribe who had once been his father's sworn brother in the ancient ritual of Anda, blood brotherhood. And when Temujin presented the coat and asked for Togrul's protection and support, the older man saw an opportunity to gain a loyal follower who might one day prove useful. And he accepted Temujin into his protection, giving him legitimacy and a measure of security that had been absent since his father's death. But alliances on the steppe were as complex and dangerous as the landscape itself. And Temujin also sought out Jamuka, a young man of his own generation who had been his closest friend in childhood, and they renewed their bond of Anda swearing oaths of eternal brotherhood under the endless sky, sharing a meal of roasted lamb, exchanging gifts of knives and horses, promising that they would be as inseparable as the shadow from the body. Though neither could see then that this friendship would eventually become one of the great tragic rivalries of the medieval world. But happiness on the steppe was always temporary, as fleeting as morning mist over the grasslands, and revenge was a dish that could be served across generations, cold and patient and absolutely inevitable. Because the Merkits had not forgotten that, decades earlier, Temujin's father Yasugi had stolen Holland from one of their warriors, and now they came in the pre-dawn darkness when the world was still caught between night and day, their horses, hooves muffled by felt wrappings, 300 raiders descending on Temujin's small camp like wolves on a wounded deer. The warning came too late, just moments before the attack. Barely enough time for Temujin to leap onto a horse and flee into the surrounding hills with his brothers and a handful of followers, and in his haste and panic and the primal instinct for survival, he left behind the one thing that mattered more than his own life. He left Bort, his wife of only a few months, and the guilt of that abandonment would haunt him with a ferocity that matched any enemy he would ever face, because on the steppe a man who could not protect his woman was no man at all. The Merkits took Bort and gave her to one of their warriors as a wife, as payment for the ancient insult, as a living reminder that the steppe never forgot and never forgave. And for months she lived among her captors, her fate uncertain, her belly slowly swelling with a child whose paternity would forever remain a shadow over Temujin's legacy. And while she endured this captivity with a strength that would later become legendary, Temujin was transformed by rage and shame into something far more dangerous than a mere tribal warrior. He went to Togrul and reminded him of every oath of brotherhood, of every debt owed to his father. And he went to Jamuka and called upon their renewed bond of Ender. And he spoke with such passion and fury that both men recognized this was not merely about rescuing one woman, but about establishing a principle that would echo across the steppe for generations. That those under Temujin's protection would never be abandoned. That loyalty would be rewarded with loyalty. That betrayal would be answered with annihilation. Together they assembled a force of 20,000 warriors, a coalition that represented something new on the steppe where unity was as rare as mercy and alliances lasted only as long as they served immediate interests. And they rode north toward the market camps with a purpose that was both personal vendetta and political statement, and the thunder of those hooves could be heard for miles across the grasslands, a sound like approaching doom, like the heartbeat of the earth itself had turned violent and vengeful. The battle was not the organized clash of medieval or European armies with their careful formations and elaborate tactics, but rather the brutal efficiency of steppe warfare. Swift cavalry charges that appeared from multiple directions simultaneously, arrows darkening the sky like locust swarms, and the screaming chaos of close combat where curved sabers found flesh and bone, and the merchants who had thought themselves safe in their scattered camps suddenly found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed by a force that moved with unprecedented coordination and ruthless determination. Temujin found Bort hidden in a cart, disguised among the fleeing refugees. And when they finally saw each other after those terrible months of separation, there were no elaborate declarations of love or relief. Just a fierce embrace that spoke of survival and reunion and the unbreakable bond that tragedy had forged between them. Though the question of the child she carried would linger like smoke that never quite clears, and when she gave birth to a son they named him Joki, which meant guest or outsider, a name that carried within it all the uncertainty and pain of those dark months. But the victory over the merchants was more than personal redemption. It was Temujin's first demonstration of his ability to unite disparate forces under a common purpose, to coordinate complex military operations across vast distances, to inspire loyalty through shared sacrifice and certain victory. And warriors across the steppe began to whisper about this young leader, who repaid friendship with unwavering support and answered insults with total destruction, and slowly, like water finding channels through rock, followers began to drift toward his camp, first in small numbers, then in growing streams of disillusioned warriors and displaced families and ambitious young men who saw in Temujin something that the steppe had not seen in generations. Yet success bred its own dangers because Jamuka watched as more and more warriors chose to follow Temujin rather than himself, watched as his anda began to eclipse him in reputation and influence, and the seeds of jealousy took root in soil made fertile by wounded pride and competing ambitions. And though they continued to ride together and share meals and speak of eternal brotherhood, a coldness crept into their interactions like winter advancing across the grasslands. The breaking point came over something so trivial it would have been laughable if it had not led to decades of warfare. A dispute about camping arrangements, about who would position their gears in which location, the kind of petty squabble that normally would have been resolved over arrogant laughter, but both men recognized it for what it truly was, a test of dominance, a question of who would lead and who would follow, and neither man's pride could accept subordination. They parted ways with elaborate courtesy and thinly veiled hostility, and the steppe that had briefly glimpsed unity fractured once again into competing factions, with Jamuka gathering the traditional aristocratic clans who believed in the old ways of inherited privilege and established hierarchy, while Temujin attracted those who had been abandoned by that system, the dispossessed and the ambitious and the capable regardless of their birth. And in this division lay the blueprint for everything that would follow, the revolutionary restructuring of steppe society based on merit and loyalty rather than bloodline and tradition. The clash between these two visions of the future came at a place called Dalen Balchot, where 13 tribes allied with Jamuka met. Temujin's smaller but fiercely loyal force, in a battle that would determine not just who controlled which grazing lands, but what kind of society would emerge from centuries of tribal chaos. And the fighting was savage beyond measure because this was not just warfare but civil war. Warriors killing men they had once called friends and brothers. Arrows fired at ranges so close you could see the faces of those you killed, and when the dust settled, Temujin had been defeated, his forces scattered across the steppe like leaves before a storm, and he retreated into the wilderness with only a handful of the most devoted followers, men who had chosen to share exile rather than abandon their leader. Jamuka celebrated his victory with a cruelty that shocked even the hardened warriors of the steppe, because he boiled 70 of Temujin's captured men alive in great iron cauldrons. A grotesque display meant to demonstrate his power and terrify potential rivals, but instead it revealed the fundamental difference between these two leaders, because Jamuka ruled through fear and Temujin through loyalty. And many of those who had fought for Jamuka looked at those boiling cauldrons and wondered what kind of man they were following. And in the years that followed, a steady stream of defectors made their way to Temujin's camps, bringing with them not just swords, but stories of Jamuka's increasing paranoia and brutality. For years, Temujin played a careful game of survival and expansion, defeating smaller tribes one by one, incorporating their warriors into his growing army, forging alliances with Togrul, whose power and legitimacy remained essential. And slowly the balance of power on the steppe began to shift, like continental plates grinding against each other, imperceptible day by day but world-changing over time. And Temujin implemented innovations that seemed minor but were actually revolutionary, organizing his forces into units of tens and hundreds and thousands, where promotion came through demonstrated ability rather than inherited status, where a shepherd's son could command nobles if he proved himself worthy, where loyalty to the unit superseded loyalty to clan or tribe. The Tatars who had poisoned his father fell before his systematic vengeance, their men slaughtered with such thoroughness that the very name Tatar became synonymous with destruction, though ironically it would later be applied to the Mongols themselves by terrified Europeans who could not distinguish between the various steppe peoples. And with each victory, Temujin gained not just territory, but the psychological momentum that makes men believe in destiny and inevitability. That transforms a leader into a force of nature. But Togrul the Wangkhan, who had been protector and almost a father figure, could not accept that his former dependent had become his equal, and perhaps his superior. And the old man's jealousy was inflamed by his ambitious son, Sengum, who saw in Temujin an existential threat to their family's dominance, and they plotted betrayal with the kind of elaborate treachery that the steppe specialized in, inviting Temujin to a feast that was actually an ambush. But Temujin had learned long ago that trust was a luxury that got you killed, and he had spies everywhere. And when he learned of the plot, he struck first with the swift brutality that was becoming his trademark. The war against the Karats was perhaps the most difficult of Temujin's career, because these were not minor tribes, but a major power with vast resources and experienced warriors. And the fighting raged across the steppe for months, armies pursuing each other through summer heat and autumn cold, victories and defeats bleeding into each other until it seemed the war might never end. But Temujin had patience, and he had a talent for exploiting any weakness. And when he finally cornered Togrul's forces near the sacred mountain of Birkenkalden, he showed no mercy to the man who had once been his protector. Because sentiment was another luxury that kings could not afford, and the Karat Confederation was destroyed so thoroughly that within a generation it would be as if they had never existed. With the Karats defeated and absorbed, with the Tatars annihilated, with Jamuka increasingly isolated and his support crumbling, Temujin had accomplished what no one in living memory had done. He had unified the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe under a single banner, and in the spring of 1206, near the source of the Anan River, A great assembly called a Kurultai gathered under a sky so blue it seemed like the very tent of heaven, and shamans performed rituals that reached back to the beginning of time. And nobles and warriors and tribal leaders from across the steppe bent their knees and swore oaths of loyalty. And Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, which meant universal ruler or oceanic ruler, a title that embodied the ambition to expand endlessly like the sea. And with this new identity came new laws, the Yasa, a legal code that applied equally to noble and commoner, that punished theft with death and adultery with execution, that guaranteed religious freedom and protected trade caravans, that transformed a collection of nomadic raiders into something approaching a nation. He organized the entire society along military lines with the decimal system extending from the army into civilian life, created a corps of messengers who could ride across the empire in days carrying orders that would be obeyed without question, established a meritocracy so radical that it scandalized the old aristocracy but inspired fierce devotion in everyone else. And perhaps most importantly, he offered a vision of unity and purpose that transcended the endless cycle of tribal revenge and petty warfare that had defined steppe life for centuries. And men who had spent their entire lives fighting their neighbors suddenly found themselves part of something larger and more glorious than they had ever imagined possible. Part of a machine designed not just for survival but for conquest on a scale that would remake the entire world. The world beyond the steppe had barely noticed the unification of the Mongol tribes, because who cared about nomadic herders in the distant grasslands when great civilizations like the Jin dynasty controlled northern China with its million-strong armies and cities that stretched beyond the horizon? When the Khwarezm Empire commanded the ancient trade routes of Central Asia with wealth that could ransom kingdoms, when Europe quarreled over its petty territories and the Islamic world reached heights of cultural and scientific achievement, that made other civilizations seem barbaric by comparison. But all of them were about to learn that the rules of warfare had changed forever, because Genghis Khan was not interested in raiding for plunder or seizing a few border towns. He was interested in conquest so total and absolute that it would leave nothing unchanged. The Jin dynasty learned this first when Mongol armies poured through the Great Wall not as a disorganized horde but as a precisely coordinated military machine that combined the mobility of cavalry with siege weapons operated by Chinese engineers who had been absorbed into the Mongol forces. And cities that had stood for centuries fell one after another because the Mongols did not just besiege them. They terrorized them, sending messengers ahead to explain that surrender meant life and trade and prosperity while resistance meant total annihilation. And when cities foolishly chose to resist, the Mongols made examples so horrifying that the next 10 cities would open their gates without a fight, understanding that this was not warfare as they knew it but something far more ruthless and calculating. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a campaign against the Western Shah. His body carried back to the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldan and buried in a secret location that has never been found, guarded by soldiers who were themselves killed to preserve the secret. But his death did not end the conquests, because he had built something that transcended any single man. A system and a vision and a momentum that would carry his descendants to the gates of Vienna and the shores of the Mediterranean and the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. His sons and grandsons would rule the largest contiguous land empire in human history, would destroy Baghdad and end the Islamic Golden Age, would bring gunpowder and printing to Europe, would create a global economy centuries before globalization became a word. And for 200 years, the world would be shaped by decisions made in the courts of Mongol Khans, by the movement of Mongol armies, by the peace or war that the Mongols chose to impose. And when their empire finally fragmented and collapsed, it left behind a world that had been permanently transformed, where East and West understood they were part of a single interconnected system, where military technology had been revolutionized, where the medieval world had been broken open and scattered to make way for what would eventually become modernity. And all of it traced back to that moment in 1206, when a man who had been born clutching blood emerged from poverty and betrayal and endless struggle to become Genghis Khan, proving that the arc of history could be bent by a single will if that will was strong enough and ruthless enough and visionary enough to see not just what the world was, but what it could become.